Good morning and welcome. Today we'll be talking about Chapter 17 from AMSCO AP European History. Chapter 17 is officially titled Global Control and European Tensions, but it's really about the age of imperialism. This is 1870 to 1914. And so imperialism is kind of the second time in European history that we see European powers going out to the rest of the world to colonize, to exploit, to take resources, to enslave, things like that. The first wave of imperialism we saw was way back in the 1500s and 1600s with what was called colonialism or colonization, colonizing the Americas especially. And now European countries turning their attention to mostly Africa and also Asia, again, to colonize, to exploit, to take resources, to enslave. And so when we talk about imperialism, again, this is 1870 to 1914, we do need to talk about the context of when this took place. And this is immediately after the Industrial Revolution. When you think of the 1800s, you should always think of industrialization, the Industrial Revolution. And think about the effects that industrialization had. Okay, industrialization led to overcrowding, it led to poverty and things like that, but it also led to incredible wealth, at least for businesses and for governments. And because of these new technologies like steam engines and steel and other things, it leads to incredibly powerful militaries. We see incredible military strength, especially among the Germans, but also the British. They built massive navies, but with the benefit of steam engine and steel and things like that. So incredible navies, incredible transportation system with railroads, advances in communication with the telegraph, where they can communicate not instantaneously, but very quickly over large distances. And so the Industrial Revolution kind of leads to imperialism. Sorry, let me start to get these notes in. So the Industrial Revolution leads to imperialism for a couple of reasons. First, it creates new technology, such as the telegraph, such as railroads, such as steamships. It also creates powerful European armies that allows them to relatively easily conquer and colonize these non-industrialized places. And then the Industrial Revolution also creates a need for more natural resources. Eventually, England is going to run out of coal, or they need rubber for their tires or things like that. Now, they could buy it from somewhere, but in the kind of arrogant, conceited mind of a European, they figure, why buy it if I can just go to Africa and take it? So there's a need for more natural resources to power those industrial machines. And there's also a need for new markets for trade. And European countries realize, okay, well, if I colonize the people of the Congo, I can force them to trade with me, and I can get all the profits and benefits of that. So that's one part of the context of imperialism. The Industrial Revolution leads to the age of imperialism. And then there's also the rise of nationalism. Let me get these notes up a little bit bigger. Nationalism, again, is kind of being willing to do anything for your nation, having blind loyalty for your nation, perhaps. But nationalism is also this idea that you and your fellow Germans or fellow Italians or fellow Frenchmen or whatever have some common history and common culture that binds you together, and you all should work together to strengthen your nation. Nationalism might just feel or sound like patriotism, but it's a relatively new concept in the late 1800s. Because people begin to shift away from kind of having a local conception of identity of who they are. They belong to a city, or they belong to a region. And now it says, no, I'm English, I'm German, I'm French, I'm Italian. And that inspires Englishmen and Frenchmen and Germans and Italians to try to show off how powerful their country is. So nationalism leads to an intense competition for power. And eventually, which we'll see at the end, it's going to lead to a series of alliances where countries are allying together to fight against each other for more power. You can see here, these are going to be the alliances of World War I. Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy, the Triple Alliance. England, France, Russia for the Triple Entente. So we also then see the rise of nationalism. which leads to intense competition for power. And it also, just kind of foreshadowing, we'll get to this later, it leads to alliances, which will eventually cause World War I. And so we do need to get an actual proper definition of imperialism. I always like to say imperialism is when a strong, industrialized country conquers and controls a non-industrialized nation, normally for resources or power, although it's not always quite that simple. This is sometimes called new imperialism. It's generally 1870 to 1914. All right, working through some of the different motivations of imperialism. Why did Europeans sail halfway around the world to conquer and enslave and exploit other peoples? Well, a lot of it was economics. Industrialization, again, created a need for expansion, at least a need from the European perspective. They needed more natural resources, like coal to power their machines, iron to build their machines, or rubber to build wheels and tires and things like that. There was also a need from the European perspective to have new markets to sell their goods to. And so what a lot of European countries begin to realize is if I want to make a lot of money and if I want to strengthen my economy, I need to export as much as possible. So exports become more important than imports. You hopefully remember an import is when you bring something into your country. And so European countries are importing natural resources. What are they exporting? Well, they're exporting their finished goods. They're exporting their manufactured goods, clothes, and things like that. And so this shows between England and Africa, by 1900, they're importing about 8 million pounds of goods, but they're exporting 21 million pounds. They're exporting way more, which allows them to make a profit. So there's a need for natural resources. There's a need for new markets. We already kind of put that. And then there's a need I'm going to say they want to maximize exports, which also maximizes profit. Now, this second point, I know it's listed under economic motivations, but I think it's really a more political motive in that because of industrialization and all the benefits, European countries are able to develop incredibly advanced militaries. They have advanced weaponry like the Maxim gun, which is an early version of a machine gun. You can see here you'd have to sit down. It's not incredibly mobile, but it was on wheels. It weighs several hundred pounds. So new weapons like the Maxim gun or the machine gun allows them to relatively efficiently conquer and control native populations. But also the germ theory. The germ theory, hopefully you remember from chapter 14, I believe, was the discovery that tiny microbes called germs cause diseases. And if we treat those germs, we can stay healthy and recover and things like that. How does that benefit militaries? Well, militaries are able to keep their soldiers healthy, help out their wounded soldiers and get them back on the battlefield as quickly as possible. It also led to a treatment for malaria, which was a disease that was native or endemic to Africa that now Europeans are able to survive. So again, for political, all of this strengthens the military with the Maxim gun, better medicine. And so there was a need for, there was a need for colonies as bases, military bases around the world and as ports for them to trade through. And really, colonies became a symbol of power. Today, we probably measure a nation's power based on how much wealth they produce, I suppose. 150 years ago, you would measure a nation's power based on, do they have any colonies and how many do they have? And so I put that as a political motivation because this is European nations wanting to prove that they belong, wanting to prove that they are a world power. By getting colonies, even a tiny country like Belgium, by getting an African colony, they're able to prove to the world, I suppose, they are worthy of respect, I suppose. And then there were some cultural motivations as well. These cultural motivations were incredibly racist. I'll just read this here. It says that Europeans believed that they were culturally superior and racially superior. And because white Europeans believed they were culturally and racially superior, they believed that they had a right or perhaps a duty to colonize others. Let me plug that in here real quick. And there's a couple key terms that go along with that. So white Europeans believed they were superior and had a right to colonize essentially the weak in their mind. Two different phrases that you might see here: survival of the fittest, or sometimes called social Darwinism. Social Darwinism took the ideas of Charles Darwin, evolution and natural selection, and applied it to societies and said, well, it's only natural for strong countries to conquer the weak. That's just normal. That's the animal kingdom. So it's only natural for strong countries to conquer weaker countries. And then the other big one is something called White Man's Burden, which was a poem by Rudyard Kipling, who was a British poet. I'll show the whole poem here. In one excerpt of the White Man's Burden, Rudyard Kipling wrote, "Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile to serve your captives' need. Take up the white man's burden, the savage wars of peace. Fill full the mouth of famine and bid the sickness cease." To take a minute to break down this poem, these two lines I always think are key. Fill full the mouth of famine and bid the sickness cease. We're seeing a personification of famine here with a capital F. So I always imagine, what would famine look like as a person? It would look like a skinny, starving kid. If you fill full the mouth of famine, okay, Europeans need to feed the hungry. And bid the sickness cease, they need to get rid of sicknesses or cure the sick. And so this is saying the white men need to feed the hungry and cure the sick. And that is the white man's burden. Now, if you think of a burden is oftentimes something you carry on your shoulders. If you have a younger sibling, you might sometimes say that your younger siblings are a burden to you because you have to babysit them or something. And so this is a great cartoon of this. A white man, I suppose this is an American, this is an Englishman, carrying the looks like native Africans on his shoulders. You can see some very racist, stereotypical depictions of those Africans there. But this is saying that it is the white man's burden. It's their duty, it's their responsibility to help these poor, savage, barbaric Africans by feeding them and by curing them. Now, in one sense, the white man's burden might sound nice. They're going and doing work for them, I suppose. But really, this is guided and motivated and driven by racism. So I'll just clarify here to make sure we're on the same page. We've definitely got racism. Okay. Looking at some examples of imperialism in both Africa and then in Asia. The best example of imperialism in Africa is in the Congo, which was colonized by Belgium in the late 1800s. Belgium was the first Belgium was the first European country to have a significant colony in the heart of Africa. Now, European countries had colonies along the border, along the coast of Africa for a couple of centuries. Belgium's the first one to go into the heart of it and to colonize and control and exploit a larger piece of Africa. Belgium's Congo was actually run by the king, King Leopold II, who ran the Congo as basically his private estate. It was not actually controlled by the Belgian government. It was the personal property of the king. He used forced labor to enslave the people, to get natural resources, especially rubber and ivory. And we'll see that over a 20-year time span or so, half of the Congolese population was killed. 10 million people out of a population of 20 million was killed. Some of that was directly killed by the Europeans. Some of them were killed by diseases. Some of them were killed because of famine caused by European imperialism. So again, the best example, or the worst example, or most infamous example, I suppose, is the Belgian Congo, of King Leopold II going there. And his motive mainly was resources, rubber and ivory. Now, after Belgium goes to the Congo, and Belgium kind of proves and shows that a strong industrialized European country can relatively easily conquer and control a non-industrialized African country, that leads to other European countries to want a peace as well. This leads to something called the Scramble for Africa, generally 1880 to 1914, where European countries basically took a map of Africa and they drew some lines and they split up Africa for themselves. So European countries basically divided up Africa amongst themselves. This was led by Otto von Bismarck from Germany at something called the Berlin Conference. The Berlin Conference is what it sounds like. It was a meeting in Germany where all the European countries got around a table and they negotiated around who gets which piece of Africa. No Africans obviously were present there. By 1914, about 95% of Africa is colonized by Europeans. I believe we'll see some photographs and then a map here. Some photographs from the Congo, a little bit graphic. It's a trigger warning, I suppose, if you need it. Focus on this man and what you think he's looking at. This photograph was taken by Alice Harris, who was a British missionary woman in the Congo, most likely to educate the Congolese in the ways of the white man. And he is staring at the severed hand and foot of his daughter. You can see right there the hand and foot of his daughter. This was a common punishment that the Belgians would inflict upon the Congolese, maiming and brutalizing and amputating the children, chopping off the children's hands or feet as a form of punishment for their parents if their parents rebelled, or if their parents didn't collect enough rubber, if they didn't meet the day's quota of natural resources, they would punish the child. Another photograph that kind of illustrates European imperialism in Africa. You see a Congolese man stripped naked being whipped with what was called a chicote, C-H-I-C-O-T-T-E. It was a whip of hippopotamus hide or hippopotamus skin. And a few things that I always find notable about this photograph. First, the man being whipped is naked, which both maximizes the physical pain, but also adds a humiliation to this as well. But he's also being whipped by another Congolese man, by another African man, which kind of shows how Europeans would exploit the native population, and the Europeans would get the native populations to do their dirty work for them. The Belgians, their hands are clean. They didn't actually inflict the punishment, and it also kind of plays some mind games with the Congolese because they're being whipped by their own kind, I suppose. And also maybe makes rebellions less likely, because if you are this man, you might not want to rebel against someone from your own tribe or village. Whereas if it was a white man, you might be more willing to rebel. So kind of a cruel exploitation of the native populations by the white Europeans. And then the after effects to Congolese children with their right hands having been chopped off as punishment, most likely because their parents rebelled or resisted or didn't collect enough rubber for the day. So again, 10 million Congolese killed over 20 years, half the Congolese population killed in just 20 years while under control of King Leopold in Belgium. And so this map, two different versions of the same map, a color version and a black and white version. This map shows us what happened to Africa. It was completely split up. Look at whatever map you want to. This one shows us that France and England seem to have the most colonies. Same thing here, France and England seem to have the most colonies. Now the Belgian Congo is huge, it's right in the heart of Africa, but that was really Belgium's only colony. You can see the two independent countries, Ethiopia, which successfully defeated the Italians in war, and then Liberia, which was envisioned as a colony to send freed American slaves. but 95% of Africa is colonized by 1914. Again, mostly France and Germany. And the one thing that I always like to point out, England. England had a dream of creating the Trans-African Railroad. They had a dream of building a railroad from the tip of Egypt all the way down to the tip of South Africa. That would have allowed them to basically control trade in the African continent and maximize their wealth. Germany, because Germany and England have an intense rivalry, Germany intentionally swoops up this piece of land called German East Africa, basically just to prevent the British from having a straight shot, to prevent the British from being able to build their railroad. And so I always like pointing out that example because it shows the rivalries between some of these countries. And so I'm just going to add a little bit more detail for the Belgian Congo. I'll maybe say that there is slavery and basically mass death, 10 million killed. Again, some of those were directly killed by the Europeans. Some of them died because of diseases or because of famine after the food was destroyed. And then I do always like this point of England. England's goal was to build a trans-African railroad, but they failed because Germany swooped in and got that piece, German East Africa. All right, briefly looking at imperialism in Asia, briefly looking at China and India. And this is really mostly just England, although some other European countries, especially the Dutch, the Netherlands, had colonies in Asia. First, England colonized China, but this was a little bit different. This was not military control. Like if you see here, European countries are completely controlling the entire country of Algeria or Egypt or Sudan. In China, England only gained control of ports, such as Hong Kong, which was one of the main trading ports in southern China. And rather than controlling the entire country, rather than replacing the Chinese government and installing their own, England basically forced them to trade with them under very favorable trading rules that would benefit the English. For example, England exported lots and lots of opium, which is a highly addictive drug, to China. So the British were basically drug dealers in the 1800s, selling drugs to China. This led to a massive war called the Opium War in the mid-1800s, where the Chinese, not surprisingly, did not want all of these foreign drugs pouring into their country. The British won. And when the British won, again, they gained control of these trading ports. So England and China, I want to say this is more about economic imperialism. England controls several ports, including Hong Kong, and they basically force China to trade with them. And I'll put opium in there as that one example. So that's a little bit different than what was happening in Africa. It's not fully taking over the country. Instead, it's economic imperialism, forcing the Chinese to trade with them. And then India was the other big example. India was originally run by the British East India Company. It was originally for trade. But eventually, after what was called the Sepoy Rebellion, very long story short, in the Sepoy Rebellion, the Indian soldiers, many of them were Hindu, they were being given bullet cartridges that were coated in the fat of beef and pork, animals that are sacred to their religion. The Indian soldiers felt naturally insulted and they rebelled. England crushed that rebellion, and as a retribution, I suppose, England began to rule India with even more of an iron fist. They made India an official colony. They killed 100,000 Indians. One of the more fascinating things that we see in British India is that the British would basically use the educated, powerful, wealthy Indians and force them to serve in the colonial Indian government. So wealthy Indians would be able to go to English schools and get government jobs and serve in the military. Again, I think back to this photograph here where the Belgians used the Africans against each other. Same concept, really, where you see the English hiring the Indians to work in their government. Now, the Indians did benefit from this. They got an education. The English also built railroad systems and factories in India. But at what cost? At the cost of their freedom, at the cost of their independence. So we'll say it was originally for trade under the British East India Company. But eventually it was an official colony. And the English, I'm going to say, hired wealthy, educated Indians to work in the colonial government. This map does a good job of showing us kind of how Asia was split up. So you can see India was, like a full-on British colony. Not all of it, but much of it was controlled by English. But then China was just some ports. You can see some other distributions here. Japan had some colonies, specifically modern-day North and South Korea. The Dutch were mostly in Singapore, Malaysia. The French, can't really see the colors very well, but the French are in Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. The US in the Philippines, at least after 1898. But again, this map does look different than the map of Africa in that, okay, some parts are fully taken over. Much of India, Vietnam, Philippines, Southeast Asia, but also much of it, China, was really just the ports. So there is an interesting distinction there. All right, I'm not gonna be able to play these videos because they won't show on the recording. We'll try to watch them in class, but if you wanna go to the link, you can watch the original Yakko's World from Animaniacs, where he names every country. And then the British Empire version, every time he says a country that's been colonized by England, he speeds up. So I'll try to play that next week. This map shows us every single country that Britain has never invaded in their history. And so counted up, there are, I don't know, 15 or 20 countries that England has never conquered or never invaded at some point. Guatemala, Bolivia, Paraguay, a handful of African countries, a few very small European countries. These are all European city-states, a couple others, and that's basically it. This all basically goes to say that England had the biggest empire in the world. England oftentimes said, or the Britain oftentimes said, the sun never sets on the British Empire. England has so many colonies throughout the world, or at some point in their history, they've had so many colonies throughout the world, from Australia, Canada, America, all throughout Africa, throughout China and other parts of Asia. Sun never sets in the British Empire. It's somewhere in the British Empire, it's always sunny, because they've controlled that much. The last couple slides is looking at maybe some other aspects of imperialism. First, criticisms of imperialism. Imperialism is incredibly brutal and bloody and exploitative, and lots of people naturally did not like that. There were two main criticisms of imperialism. One was it's immoral and inhumane the way we're treating the native peoples. The other criticism is that imperialism is being driven by capitalism and greed, and that's the problem. The problem really is greed and capitalism. So when we have criticisms of imperialism, first main criticism is that it's kind of inhumane, immoral treatment of the natives. And then the other one is that capitalism is the true evil. It's kind of all about greed or a lust for money or something like that. One example of this first criticism is Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, that we might read an excerpt of. We'll see if we have time. Joseph Conrad was an author who wrote a fictional account of going to the Belgian Congo, and wrote all about how the true heart of darkness, the true evil, is the heart of the white man. So the white man is maybe the true savage. And then the other best example of this is the Congo Reform Association. All of those photographs that you saw earlier, let's go back and look at them real quick. All of these photographs that you saw, they were distributed by a group called the Congo Reform Association that in both Europe and America recruited some of the most powerful authors like Mark Twain and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who wrote Sherlock Holmes, and got them to publish these photographs and publish articles criticizing King Leopold. The Congo Reform Association published photos and articles criticizing the Belgian Congo. And it did work, sort of. It forced King Leopold to reform what he was doing in the Congo. So there's one criticism, kind of the humanity or morality of it. The other argument is that capitalism is the true evil. Capitalism, remember, says that you should be able to have private ownership of property. You should be able to own your own business, and government should stay hands out. Now, what does capitalism lead to? It leads to a lust for profit, a lust for profit and wealth and greed above all else. And so lots of people, including Vladimir Lenin, who's going to become a leader in the Soviet Union and Russia, they begin to say, no, the real problem is capitalism. The real problem is that nations are exploiting these colonized peoples and plundering the world for their own self-interest. And so if we want to solve this problem, you've got to change the economy. So we'll say nations are exploiting people, stealing resources just for their own benefit. And so the only solution basically is to destroy capitalism and to shift, these people would say, to communism or perhaps to socialism. And we'll see that as we move forward to the Soviet Union after World War I. All right, very briefly looking at art. These encounters with kind of non-Western, non-white cultures begin to change art. And it leads to a new appreciation for something called the noble savage, quote unquote. Natives were seen as pure, as perfect, as not tainted or scarred or contaminated by modern society. And so oftentimes when you look at depictions of native peoples, of Africans or Indians or whatnot in art, they're oftentimes naked. And they're oftentimes depicted in kind of a primitive, almost tribal way. This is Les Demoiselles d'Avignon by Pablo Picasso. Primitivism, it was sometimes called, depicting them almost as if they were savages, as if they were animals. You kind of see their masks there. And so this was both an appreciation for native purity, quote unquote, but also, I mean, this is incredibly racist, depicting them as basically animals. And then the last thing that we'll look at, and I'm going to put this up top, is how imperialism leads to an alliance system. By 1900, nearly all of Africa, much of Asia was colonized by Europe. Again, that was because of industrialization. That was because of superior militaries. So this led to a global economy. I actually put this in here as effects of imperialism. It creates a global economy. Countries are trading not just with each other, not just within their own country, but around the entire world. Specifically, colonies provided natural resources or were forced to provide natural resources, and then Europeans would export manufactured goods. Another big effect of this is this conflict for lands leads to competition, it leads to tensions, and this eventually leads to an alliance system. We had two alliances. There was a Triple Alliance, that was Germany, Italy, Austria, Hungary, and you had the Triple Entente, that was England, France, and Russia. Now, each of these alliances, Germany created the Triple Alliance to isolate France. They were worried about France getting too much power. And so France allied with Russia and England to combat the rising spread of Germany. Now, at first, a lot of these alliances were economic alliances, but eventually they became alliances of what's called mutual defense. An attack on one is considered an attack on all, and all countries will defend. And so by the time we get to 1914, the spark of World War I, a small conflict right over here between Austria-Hungary and Serbia is going to lead to a world war involving all of these countries because of the alliance system. So let's get all this on one page, and then you all can pause it if you need to. We've got the context, motivations, and examples. Pause there if you need to. And then you got the criticisms and effects.